I want to talk about drugs for a moment. A story that got my attention. Again, I talked about it at the end of the podcast today. If you go and listen to it, I spent the last few minutes of the podcast on it. And I'm curious to get your guys' thoughts as it relates to decriminalizing drugs. And different states have done this to varying degrees over the last couple of years. But in November, one state went above and beyond what any state had previously done as it relates to decriminalizing drugs. The state of Oregon decriminalized everything. They decriminalized meth, heroin, you name it, cocaine. They decriminalized all drugs. And again, I know this puts me on sort of the conservative side of this issue, but I don't think that's a good idea. Now, look, I get the idea that we have a problem in terms of how we punish some things in the drug world versus others. How we lock people up for marijuana. And we have people locked up behind bars. And I know Barack Obama did some stuff with regard to this as far as when it came to the end of his administration and pardoning people and things of that nature. And look, I'm not talking about, the fact that we should be locking people up for the wacky weed for years on end or anything like that. I think marijuana should be legalized everywhere. I've tried it. And I'm not saying it because I've tried it. I'm saying I've tried it. And I know some people might argue, well, it's the gateway drug and da-da-da-da-da. I get it. If somebody is prone to addiction, they're going to get there regardless of whether it's marijuana or through some other means. But I have a hard time reconciling the idea of legalizing all drugs, not legalizing, but decriminalizing all drugs, and telling people instead of going to prison, if you use drugs and get caught, or using and distributing and all that stuff, if you use drugs, we're not going to send you to jail. We're going to send you to rehab. So what you'll have is, instead of the revolving door of people going in and out of prisons in America, and you'll essentially have people trading in jumpsuits for civilian clothes and their 3 square meals a day in jail to whatever they get in a rehab clinic. But it's going to be the same revolving door regardless. And if you're decriminalizing drugs, if I'm a drug user, I'm going to Oregon now. Matter of fact, Portland's a beautiful city. I've been there. I'm going to Portland. I'm going to Oregon now if I'm a drug user, because I know there is zero consequences. I know people will say, well, but rehab is a consequence. There are, relatively speaking, zero consequences for your actions. How many people go to rehab and just go through the motions, then get spit back out onto the streets? What's the recidivism going to be like in Oregon? I think it's going to be a fascinating case study. Who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this winds up being a good thing. But to me, telling people that there are no consequences for your actions and strictly saying it's an addiction issue, it's a mental health issue, and that's how we're going to treat it. My father used to have a saying. I mentioned this on the podcast the other day that came out today. My father used to have a saying. My father and I agree on almost nothing. The only thing we can agree on is that we agree on nothing. My dad and I agree on nothing. Love the man, but we just don't agree on anything. He used to say something to me as a kid, and he was a disciplinarian. But he used to say something to me as a kid as I got older, I sort of started to understand it more, even though I resented some of the way our father handled discipline. But at the end of the day, look, all of his kids turned out, relatively speaking, okay. Whether that's because of or in spite of, we'll never really know. I wouldn't have disciplined my kids the way he disciplined us, but that was his choice, and that was how he did it. And you know what? For the most part, we all turned out okay. But he used to have a saying, and it basically went like this: a little fear is a good thing. A little fear goes a long way. A little fear in this case, when we talk about decriminalizing drugs, now there's no fear because there are no harsh repercussions for your actions. So to me, a little fear is the idea that, you know what, if I don't choose to get my act together, if I don't choose to make the right decisions when it comes to rehab, if I don't choose to do the things that are necessary to help myself in terms of progress, if I don't do these things, I could wind up being locked away. There are consequences. There have to. We just went through this for 4 years. Not to go political here, but just for a second. There have to be guardrails of some kind in every society. It can't simply be live and let live. Hey, if it doesn't harm me and I'm not harming others, what's wrong with that? No big deal. If I choose to do drugs, who's it impacting? Unfortunately, in many cases, there are people that will rob, steal, kill, cheat, do whatever is necessary to get that next fix. So it does have an impact on other people. Not everybody does that. I recognize that. But addiction comes with those sorts of issues. I used to sit in my father, after he retired from AT&T, where he worked for a number of years. He worked for the phone company. I used to sit with, I used to occasionally go visit my father. His friend, family friend, owned a pawn shop in Connecticut, New Haven, like the ghettos of New Haven, Grand Avenue. Go look it up. An area loaded with its share of problems, we'll just say. But my dad used to work 3 days a week, 4 days a week, 5 days a week, depending on the week. He used to work in this pawn shop in New Haven. And I used to watch people come in to the pawn shop. I'd just sit there and come keep him company for a few minutes, say hi to him and his friend Bill, they were running the store together. And I would have this conversation with them about a myriad of things. And as we'd sit there and talk, people would be coming in and out, and they would be pawning off their most prized possessions in some cases, and in some cases, things you would never even think to go pawn. Your children's toys, a DVD player, selling CDs, a wedding ring, maybe an heirloom left behind by a parent. I'll get to that in a second. Or a loved one. And I'd watch these people come in and out. And they'd all have a story. Why I need this much money. Oh, please, can you just give me a few more bucks for this? And in some cases, it was obvious what these people were doing. All you had to do was look at them. Well, that's stereotyping. That's profiling, Jason. You can't look at something. No. I'm 43 years old. I know what I saw in that shop. And these were people coming in and selling off their possessions down to the last thing they owned just to go get that next fix. some cases, they were coming to the shop and selling something that was stolen. Later in the day, you'd see a report of, the shop has to look at this sheet that comes in every day, and it lists things that are stolen. If it was something they received that happened to be stolen, they got to report it to the police, and so on and so forth. But I saw in that shop some of the ramifications from people's decisions when it came to drug use. And again, I appreciate addiction. I have dealt with addiction since I was a teenager. Okay? Every day I wake up. Every single day I wake up. Even if it's just for a fleeting second, some days more than others. I wake up and I want nothing more than to go to a casino. And go to a craps table. Or go to a blackjack table. Or place a wager on a sporting event. I have dealt with that since I was 18 years old, 25 years. Even earlier than that, really. Because I started gambling when I was in high school. Betting slips, kids at Notre Dame High School, handing out betting slips, taking wagers. So I know addiction. I know what it's like. I know what it's like to wake up every day and need that fix. Like I said, some days are worse than others. Sometimes you slip. You relapse, so to speak. But to me, there's always been consequences for those actions. I lost the first love of my life as a result of those addictions that I was dealing with. Gone. He couldn't take it anymore. He left. Didn't stop me, though. Still kept gambling. Still kept throwing money away. I understand addiction. So this isn't coming from somebody who's speaking from a position of privilege as somebody who doesn't understand addiction. I get it. I understand addiction. But there has to be consequences. There have to be guardrails in society that not just protect other people, but protect you from yourself. Has to be consequences in a civilized world. I'm curious to know what you think. We have a chat box on the screen. You could weigh in with your thoughts there. You can leave us a comment on Facebook or Twitch, YouTube, Twitter. We're on all those platforms, and you're free to leave a thought. What do you think of the idea of decriminalizing all drugs, as the state of Oregon has now done? I don't think it's a good idea. First of its kind legislation in the nation in Oregon, as I mentioned. Measure 110, including heroin, cocaine, meth, and oxycodone, all decriminalized. So here's the way it works. Instead of a criminal justice-based approach, as this story in USA Today points out, the state's going the route of healthcare-based. Addicts will be offered treatment instead of prison time. Those in possession will be fined $100. A citation that will be dropped if they agree to a health assessment. So they don't have to pay the $100 ultimately if they just say, you know what, I'll go get the health assessment. I'll choose behind what's door number 2. The law goes into effect tonight. And it'll be put into effect over the next decade by the state officials at the Oregon Health Authority. And there are people that hope this is something that takes hold nationally. That we get to a place where all drugs are decriminalized all over the country. And here's another very fair question, I think, in all of this. What does this mean for the war on drugs at the border? Things coming in from south of our border, things that come in through our ports, even things that come in from north of the border. What does it mean when you say you're going to decriminalize all drugs? And it's a movement they're hoping will take place all over the country. And I know people will say, well, you don't understand because you're not a person of color. And drug criminalization disproportionately impacts people of color across the United States. I can't argue with you. I can't disagree with you. But that doesn't mean you don't take away the guardrails to a civilized country. I know other countries have tried this, and there's been numerous studies done that go both ways. In 2016, according to a Drug Policy Alliance study, there were more than 1.5 million drug arrests, and more than 80% of those were just for possession. Now, before anybody says, well, see, it's only possession. All right. If you're possessing it, either you're selling it, and who knows who you're selling it to. You could be selling it to somebody underage. You could be selling it to somebody who's an addict. You could be selling it to somebody who's going to kill themselves, whatever. Or you're using it. So I don't understand why, well, 80% is only for possession. Yeah, I smell the weed on you. You know? I mean, come on. And I get some of this is trying to help minorities that are disproportionately affected by drug arrests. And sometimes they get, in fact, many times they get much harsher sentences than their white counterparts who are arrested for the same things. That shouldn't happen. That is a problem that needs to be addressed. There needs to be equal punishment under the law. It doesn't happen. I get it. But simply giving up on the problem, and I know people say, no, they're going to rehab. Throwing away all consequences for one's actions, that's giving up on the problem. That's saying, you know what? Throw our hands up. It'll be very interesting to see how this plays out over the next several years. Like I said, let me know what you think. You can hit me up. Always hit me up on any of our platforms, and I'll read them as we go throughout the show. I can't imagine living in a state where the drug laws are basically non-existent. I'll give you an example. Singapore has some very strict drug laws. I'll pull this up real quick, only because I find it fascinating. Misuse of drug acts in Singapore. The possession, consumption, manufacturing, import, export, or trafficking of a certain list of drugs, which I'll go through in a second. A lot of people always the reason I'm mentioning Singapore is a lot of people who see me here often ask me, what's the differences? You know, what's Singapore like? Well, I hear they can't chew gum there. I always get that one. You can't chew gum, or you get caned. I always get the gum and caning comments. That's all people know about Singapore. That and Crazy Rich Asians. And as somebody who's relatively new here, I'm still learning about Singapore. Thankfully, I'm happily partnered to a Singaporean, so the learning curve is a little easier, and our friends help me out and kind of show me the ropes. But I want to read you from the law, the Misuse of Drugs Act in Singapore. The possession, consumption, manufacturing, import, export, or trafficking of these drugs that I'll list in a second, and other controlled drugs in any amount are illegal. Persons caught with less than the mandatory death penalty amounts. You heard me right. Death penalty amounts. You ready? Opium, 100 grams is presumed trafficking. Morphine, 3 grams is presumed trafficking. These are all presumed trafficking. Heroin, 2 grams. Cannabis, 15 grams. Cannabis mixture, 30 grams. Cannabis resin, 15 grams. Cocaine, 3 grams. Hashish, 10 grams. Meth, 25 grams. That's presumed trafficking. Now, if you have these numbers, if you have this amount of those drugs, it's the mandatory death penalty. Opium, 1,200 grams. Morphine, 30 grams. Heroin, 15 grams. Cannabis, 500 grams. It's a lot. Cannabis mixture, 500 grams. Cannabis resin, 100 grams. Cocaine, 30 grams. Hashish, 200 grams. Meth, 250 grams. Mandatory death penalty in this country. Persons caught with less than the mandatory death penalty amounts, which were the presumed trafficking amounts, face penalties ranging from caning up to 24 strokes to life in prison. Pursuant to a law change in 2009, cannabis and marijuana mixtures diluted with other substances are treated under the same under Singapore law. So they have Class A drugs and Class B drugs and the like. Now, I don't know what all of this means, and I haven't gone and done the drug use statistics. You know, what the statistics are like. But I would imagine with those types of laws, there is a deterrent in terms of keeping people from using drugs. An article from February 2019, though, says, despite tough penalties, drug abuse in Singapore still on the increase. People still abusing painkillers and opioids of different kinds. 2016, the number of drug abusers arrested by the Central Narcotics Bureau in Singapore were 3,265. A year later, that number dropped to less than 3,100. 40% of those arrested were made up of new abusers. Out of the 1,249 new abusers arrested, nearly 70% had not exceeded the age of 30. That means you still have a generation of younger people, despite knowing what the consequences are for using, you still have people in this country that use. So even though the deterrence is there, and I know some people will say, well, see, you're arguing against your own point. No, I'm giving you the facts. But I got news for you. Before I came into this country, I made sure there wasn't anything that even had a trace of marijuana potentially on it. Because I lived in California and I was around people that smoked and used marijuana and probably other substances. I made sure, though, knowing I was coming to Singapore, I wasn't going to put myself in a position to get caned. That ain't happening. Not to me. Drug possession in Singapore is a serious crime, and obviously it is punished in such a way. But what is the answer? If punishment isn't enough of a deterrent, is the answer simply throwing your hands up and saying, we're just going to throw the rules out the window and we're just going to send you to rehab? And hopefully that fixes the problem. I'll be curious to get your thoughts on it. Again, hit me up on Twitter at The Back Page and on our intersecting media platforms on YouTube, Facebook, and did I miss one? Twitch, of course.